I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Today we're exploring an exclusive interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Inflation, civil service reform and Brexit opportunities. That and of course those Chris Pincher allegations of groping, and it's the 25th anniversary of Hong Kong's handover. All that to come after the headlines.
Good morning, it's just gone 9:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister's facing calls to expel his former Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher, from the party after he quit following a drunken incident. In his resignation letter to Boris Johnson, Mr Pincher admitted drinking too much and embarrassing himself and others. Labour's questioning how he's still allowed to be a party member and claim the Conservatives are mired in sleaze and scandal. Secretary of State for Wales Simon Hart told GB News it's too early to say exactly what action should be taken.
Well, I think this only came to light, don't forget, at about 8 o'clock last night. So it's early days yet in terms of how the Chief Whip and others decide to proceed, ascertaining precisely what the facts were, making sure that people who felt exposed to the particular story get properly looked after. There's quite a lot of moving parts to this which need to be resolved during the day. So I think I hesitate to try and sort of second guess or prejudge, what may or may not happen as a result of all of this.
Russian missile strikes have killed at least 17 people in Ukraine overnight. Officials say the attacks destroyed residential buildings in the port city of Odessa. Emergency workers are still looking for survivors. Over 30 people are understood to have been injured. It's after Russian troops withdrew from the embattled Snake Island yesterday. Police officers in Scotland are withdrawing their goodwill amid an ongoing dispute over pay. They're banned by law from striking, but the move's being called the most overt demonstration of action by police in Scotland in over 100 years. From 5 o'clock this afternoon, officers won't take radio equipment home when their duty ends, nor will they start their shifts early. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon urged those involved to work together constructively. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News now. It's back to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, yesterday, I caught up with the Minister for Brexit Opportunities and Government Efficiency, Jacob Rees-Mogg, in North East Lincolnshire, where 70% of the public voted to leave the European Union in that historic 2016 referendum. In a national exclusive, and when I pressed him on the current cost of living crisis, the minister admitted for the first time that there's an explicit policy of fiscal tightening, with government spending not keeping up with inflation on purpose. Well, this wide-ranging interview covered issues from Brexit opportunities to civil service modernisation and, of course, the wider economy. Let's take a listen. Welcome to Cleethorpes. Today we've come to North East Lincolnshire to talk about Brexit opportunities in an area of the country that voted 70% to leave the European Union. I caught up with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg here at Papa's, the fish and chip shop that says it's the biggest in the world. Indeed, the fish and chip shop that was voted best in the UK in 2019. So, Jacob, you've just come from a civil service live event talking to 700 members of the civil service about one of your key roles, which is government efficiency. What do you have to say?
Well, what I wanted to say was, first of all, to thank them, because lots of civil servants really do a fantastic job delivering the services that the British public need. And all they ever read about, particularly from me, is I'm trying to reduce the numbers and I want to get them back into the office. And they need to be said thank you to, because they do work very hard, and without them public services wouldn't be operating. So that was the first point. And then to discuss how you reform the civil service to make it more efficient and so that it delivers the services that are needed with lower costs. And that's about providing the learning and development for civil servants so that they can improve the skills that they've got, and as they do that, get promoted and earn more money. So there is a positive for them, but at the same time reduce the total number. And you see this, a good example is DVLA. You know people have had difficulties getting driving licences, so that seems to be a bit better now. But people who applied online actually were getting their driving licences back pretty quickly. So if you were changing your address, you could do it online, and that was returned swiftly. If you were changing your name and your address, you had to do it by post, and that was taking months. And there is so much more you can do, particularly with the ability to check against other databases. Obviously, historically, if somebody was changing their name, you wanted to make sure you weren't creating a false identity. But there are so many cross-checks you can do with data that are available that it's the sort of thing that ought to be possible to do online.
See, people don't normally associate you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, with modernisation, with technology, with using the internet to make things more efficient. But this is a key part of your role now.
It is, but it's also something I find very convenient in daily life, as we all do. I was actually very keen at the beginning of the pandemic to have Parliament meeting remotely, because I felt it was so important that Parliament continued. When faced with the alternative of no Parliament or a remote Parliament, I was arguing very strongly that Parliament had to continue to hold the government to account. What I then went on to say was that now this has passed, we can get back to normal. So it's using technology where it is the right thing to do.
So do you see that in some circumstances, people working from home, flexible working, can boost productivity as well? It's not necessarily a binary situation.
That's absolutely right. For some people in some jobs it works very well. There are some highly technical jobs where you need to get on with the detail of your work and you don't want to be disturbed and you're not in regular meetings, and you can get on with that very well from home. There are other jobs, and they may be developing policy, where you need to be discussing things with your colleagues. You need to issue a passport. You cannot issue a passport from your back room. You really can't, because passports need to be held in a secure environment where you need to be in your office most days. And so it's getting that balance right that I think is so important.
This is one of your big drives. You've been now publishing statistics in terms of where civil service, where people who work for the civil service have been going to their core departments. What can you tell us about those numbers?
Well, they're getting better until the railways went on strike. And this does show the selfishness of strike action, because people being in the office does lead to services being delivered to the British public better. When the railways go on strike, then you find that fewer people are in, and this affects the delivery of services. So I think it's important to underline the selfishness of unnecessary strike action.
And so these strikes that took place last week...
The figures dipped for last week, having been on a pretty good rising trend previously.
Let's move on to the other half of your brief, of course, not just government efficiency, but Brexit opportunities. And last week you announced a new dashboard on the government website of retained EU law. A dashboard that anyone in the country can go and look at and see the thousands of pieces of EU legislation that are still on our statute books. What's the idea behind this dashboard?
The idea behind it is partly that people can look at it and say, why have we got this ridiculous rule? And I'm encouraging people to do that. I was actually talking to the fishing industry yesterday, the Scottish fishing industry, with David Duguid, who's a fellow Member of Parliament, brought some constituents in. And in my briefing it said there are 499 pieces of EU law that affect the fishing industry. And we want to help the fishing industry, and therefore I said to them, please tell me, which of these bits are most onerous, which get in the way of you doing what you're doing efficiently, and then let's see if DEFRA can review them and ideally get rid of them. And that's the process, that we want to look at every law in turn and say, is this law really necessary? Does it actually help the economy? Because we've got a cost of living problem. How do you deal with the cost of living problem? You tighten monetary policy, which the Bank of England's doing. You tighten fiscal policy, which is happening. But you also need supply-side reforms that make things cheaper and easier for people.
Is fiscal policy being tightened? The Prime Minister's boasting of £37 billion in extra spending.
In real terms, yes, because the spending settlements were based on an inflation rate of about 2%, and inflation rate is now 9%, so there will be real reductions in the available public expenditure. They haven't been increased to meet the increase in the inflation rate. So there have been some ameliorations which have an effect, but the total picture will be one of a tightening of the fiscal situation.
See, this is interesting because it's not something that many of your colleagues in the Cabinet have articulated in terms of how to deal with the causes of inflation. We hear so much about how the government is dealing with the consequences of inflation, but when it comes to those causes, the government hasn't really been saying that it does want fiscal tightening.
It is fundamental to understand the causes because, bear in mind, inflation hits the least well-off in society the hardest. It hits the elderly on fixed incomes, and it hits the young who are just starting on their careers, who don't have a rapidly growing income. And this is really important, that we tackle the causes of inflation. And this is doing things that are difficult to do. I mean, increasing interest rates is hard for people. Tightening fiscal policy is hard for people. Therefore, we need to go further and faster with supply-side reforms, because that's the one thing that ameliorates the otherwise tightening situation. But the Governor Bank of England was setting out, I think yesterday, how difficult he sees the economy being. And this is a global problem, that there is a global inflation. It comes from globally loose money policy going back to 2008, and it comes from interruptions in supply chains from COVID. These, I think, the primary drivers. And then, of course, Ukraine on top of that. And I think we need to set out how difficult it is and then what we're doing to solve it, so that people understand the decisions that are going to be made, and, of course, can help in terms of retained EU law, by saying, actually, if you do this, that makes life easier, that makes life more prosperous.
So a really interesting three-pronged approach there. Monetary tightening, fiscal tightening, and supply-side reforms. And those supply-side reforms, which are more your purview than the other two areas, have come under some criticism. Some people say that a lot of these regulations that you point to are trivial, that they don't really add up to all that much. What's your response to that criticism?
1,000 trivial things make something quite substantial. But that's the point. That what the EU did was it strangled enterprise by thousands of pettifogging regulations, each one in and of itself minor, but cumulatively leading to a decline in economic growth and the prospects for economic growth. So yes, we've got to deal with all the individual ones, but sometimes something that you may think of as not being important, so take the approval of drugs regulation, leads to a phenomenal economic consequence. So billions of pounds. But take the regulations on HGV drivers. As I said, Grant Shapps got rid of quite a number of those, and therefore we didn't have a shortage of drivers stopping Christmas taking place, which we were being threatened with. Now, you may say that whether or not I can drive a car pulling a trailer because I took my test before 1997 and you can't because you took it after 1997 is fundamentally trivial, and how can I disagree? But when you take a dozen and a half regulations away, you suddenly find you've got the ability to get lorry drivers who you need before Christmas. Bingo.
It's really interesting listening to that Brexit campaign. Of course, we're sitting here in north-east Lincolnshire, an area that voted 70% to leave the EU. And we heard so often during that campaign, whether it was the EU controlling the power of our vacuum cleaners or something that you've been talking about more recently, the fact that you can't have sparkling wine in anything other than a glass bottle. I mean, these things are now finally going to be dealt with.
Yes, that's right. We have the ability to do it. And you have to ask the fundamental question. Not just should we lessen this EU regulation, but do we need a regulation at all? Can't we just allow consumers to decide for themselves what type of vacuum cleaner they want to buy, what type of container they want their sparkling wine, let's call it champagne and wind up the French, what type of container they want their English champagne in.
It's interesting, though, listening to you talking about this big deregulatory agenda. And it's clear that this is something that you passionately believe in. It's something that you think is a big benefit of Brexit. Do you think the rest of the government agrees with you? Because if we look at the direction of government over the last, not even couple of years with the pandemic, but even before then, we have been seeing a greater role from the state, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister talking about new roles for the state, and in many areas talking about enhancing regulation rather than reducing it.
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister would have appointed me to this role if he weren't quite committed to deregulation and to getting the most of Brexit opportunities. But he could have appointed anybody. He could have appointed some fanatical regulator had he wanted to, but he didn't. And I have had, in the job I've been doing since February, his complete support in what I'm trying to do. And I think that is where most members of the government stand.
So what is success for you then? Looking at how Brexit might turn this country into not quite a Singapore on Thames, but something closer to a model that looks more like that than the European model of a more dirigist society.
I think we're looking to Singapore on the Humber at the moment, rather than on Thames, considering where we are. I think we should be a flexible, open economy. We should, one of the things I'm doing with the single trade window, minimise barriers to trade so that goods can come in and out of this country easily, helping the ports like Grimsby and Immingham that I'm visiting today to ensure that the country is more prosperous. Any country in history that's ever adopted free trade, even when it's done it unilaterally, has prospered having done so. And that is what we should do. Free trade is one of those extraordinary things that it benefits the giver more than the receiver, or at least as much as the receiver. And that is really important.
Yes, it's really interesting listening to trade discussions and discussion around trade discussions. Importing cheaper things is seen as a concession, whereas to most consumers that would be seen as a benefit. But
You're absolutely spot on. And I was speaking to a lady from The Sun earlier about Tesco's decision not to stock Heinz baked beans. And this is fantastic because Tesco is standing up for its customers. And there's an awful lot of government that stands up for the producer interest. What's the EU fundamentally did? And so GBNews, The Sun, Tesco's stand up for the customer. That's what politicians should do too.
It's interesting. This will be a big, big battle because, of course, the vested interests will be opposing all of these deregulatory attempts because the way that the system is currently constructed favours those incumbents.
Oh, yes. I mean, I don't cover this because of potential for conflict of interest. But if you take MiFID II, and I speak as somebody who founded an investment management company, once you've got financial regulation, once you've gone through the pain and the cost of setting up MiFID II, you think, whoopee, no new competitors can come in. So when the government says, oh, we might do something about that, you say, oh, no, we've spent the money, please don't do that. Let's keep the nasty competitors out. But if you're consumer-focused, you want to say, let's make this more competitive.
Although I suppose some of those problems in terms of doing consumer-focused things is that consumer benefits are more dispersed, whereas producer benefits are more concentrated, and you get that sort of organisation. But finally in this conversation, I do want to talk about the free port status coming to this area, coming to the Humber. What does a free port really mean? And what is Brexit going to deliver in terms of free port status for this area?
Well, Brexit allows us to do it in a way that we couldn't possibly do it whilst in the European Union, because the EU says it's state aid and so on and so forth. You can do all sorts of things with a free port. Depends how far you want to go, but you can give tax advantages. You can have customs-free areas for the free ports. You can have, as they had in Docklands when that was developed, you can have specific planning authorities so that you don't have to go through the cumbersome planning regulations. There are all sorts of things you can do with free ports. But it is a fundamental freedom being outside the European Union. And what does it do? It allows enterprise to flourish. I mean, there is an argument you should make the whole of the UK a free port. But perhaps we'll have to be a little patient for that.
So the free port in this area is going to be really quite expansive. There are going to be tax incentives. There are going to be freer ways to do customs. But particularly on building regulations, are we looking at genuinely an area now where we could be able to build?
Well, it will depend on exactly how the free port is designed, and it isn't finalised, but it is one of the things that you can do And ports, I was speaking to the Immingham port earlier, they have some proposals that they think under current regulations would take them 6 years to do. Well, we need it tomorrow, not in 6 years. They're so sclerotic for the economy. So the job must be to make free ports as effective as possible to get things done.
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg, it's been an absolutely fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. Thank you so much for making
Always
the
a
time.
pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tom, for that excellent interview, if I do say so myself. A little bit tongue-in-cheek there. But today also marks the 25th anniversary of Hong Kong's 1997 handover from Britain to Beijing. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, is visiting the city for the first time since the pandemic started, overseeing the ceremonies taking place today. It's also Xi's first visit since the national security law was introduced that critics say has been used to crush the city's opposition movement and smother dissent and democracy. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Cheng-Ching Kwong, a Hong Konger living in exile, an activist and campaigns coordinator for the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. Thank you so much for joining me here in the studio. It's fascinating and so disheartening seeing what has happened in Hong Kong over the last few years. From your perspective, what was it like to make that move, to decide to leave the city that was your home?
I was born 1 year before the 1997 handover, so I grew up in Hong Kong where it was relatively free. I was taught to think critically, taught to say whatever I saw fit. But then I saw things that should change as I became a teenager, and then every time it changed, it's always been for the worse. And at some point, you realize if you are trying to do something for Hong Kong for the cause of democracy and freedom, then you might have to leave Hong Kong, and you might have to go and ask those stakeholders in the international community to do something to hold China to account. And that's when I decided if I want to do my job as an activist as well, I might have to consider leaving Hong Kong. And that's how I made the decision.
And I suppose the big change that needs to come now, it's so hard to affect change within Hong Kong. If you go out onto the streets, if you hold up a banner vaguely critical of the government, you could be arrested. I suppose you need to make that change in countries like Britain, in countries like America. How much of a reception have you had in the free parts of the world?
I'd say recently, especially in the last 2 days, we have seen a huge change in discourse coming from the UK government. Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, they're both saying we have to have accountability, holding China to account for the human rights abuse it has done in Hong Kong and in the region. We have yet to see any kind of action to back that up. But it's a huge change to see that they are starting to talk about accountability, because this is something that was lacking in the past few years. And in other countries, discourse are slowly shifting too, from seeing China as a huge market for them to enter, to see it as a strategic competitor, or even worse, a threat to democracy and freedom. We do see that, but we still need concrete actions beyond empty hand wringing to actually back those discourse up.
So what concrete action do you want to see the free world taking against the Chinese Communist Party and its clear abuses of freedom, democracy and human rights in Hong Kong?
To say the least, I think each and every free government should implement individual sanctions against Hong Kong and Chinese officials who are closely involved in the erosion of freedom in Hong Kong. For example, John Lee, Carrie Lam, and all of the other officials that are involved. And also, they can actually do many things to help the situation in Hong Kong too, like scrutinizing export control of dual-use goods or goods that can be used for surveillance and crackdown. Do not let your entities inside your country to play a role in aiding crackdown in Hong Kong. And also don't let the companies who are aiding crackdowns to enter your supply chain. Companies like Hikvision, like many other companies who are fueling the surveillance technology in China and Hong Kong.
Well, Cheng-Ching, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming in and airing that case. I wish you all the best in your continued campaigning, and let's hope that some freedom may return to Hong Kong and indeed wider China too. Thank you for joining us. Well, moving on. This week, a private member's bill proposing a replacement to the House of Lords with an elected Senate had its first reading in the Commons. Its author, Paul Maynard, Conservative MP for Blackpool North and Cleveleys, joins me now. And Paul, thank you so much for joining us on the programme today. Just before we get to your bill, I'm afraid we can't avoid that significant news that broke last night, that Deputy Chief Whip of the Conservative Party, Chris Pincher, has resigned from the government saying he drank far too much and embarrassed himself and others, having been alleged to have groped two men at the Carlton Club last night. First of all, should the whip be suspended from Chris Pincher?
That's not something I have a particular view on. I haven't discussed it with Mr. Pincher himself. I know he's spoken to the Chief Whip. That's very much a matter I will leave at the discretion of the Chief Whip. Mr. Pincher's accepted his behaviour wasn't appropriate or acceptable and has taken, I think, probably an appropriate step.
I wonder what this says about the broader culture in Westminster, of course, because we've just had two by-elections where Conservative MPs have resigned over sexual misconduct. There have been many stories swirling, and an anonymous member has been asked to stay away from the House as well. Is this a particular problem?
I always think I take a very cautious approach at drawing longer-term, wider conclusions about what this tells us about Parliament and members of Parliament. We see stories affecting all political parties from month to month. There's been an SNP problem as well, I know. So I'm always careful at drawing too many conclusions. I've always thought that maybe as someone who's teetotal myself for medical reasons, that I'm rather glad, because I sometimes think there's too much alcohol late at night in the Commons. But that's just a personal opinion from someone who doesn't even drink. So, I think the vast majority of all MPs, frankly, on all sides, are there because they happen to believe in public service and want to do the right thing.
Well, getting on to that public service now, your private members' bill proposes replacing the House of Lords in one of the most radical ways that we've heard. We've heard lots of proposals for different reforms of the House of Lords over the years, from term limits to various sections of it being half elected and half not. Why, in your view, does it need to be turned into a fully elected Senate?
Well, I've always believed that Tories should be radical and shouldn't shy away from radical solutions. And we've tried time and time again to have voluntary solutions, such as you've identified around retirement ages, length of service, reducing the numbers in the upper house. To me, there's a more fundamental problem that they haven't been elected. They're not responsible to the wider nation as a whole, and they occasionally stray beyond their role as a revising chamber into seeking to also be a legislating chamber and challenging the will of the elected lower chamber. So it's a whole mesh of concerns in a way. I think the only way to really resolve it is to make sure it's elected by the people of this country.
Is there not an issue there, though, that currently, if there's a disagreement between the Commons and the Lords, the Commons always wins out? They can use what's called the Parliament Act, they can force through legislation, although it is delayed. With an elected Senate, the Commons would have its supremacy challenged, and if anything, there could be more gridlock.
Well, theoretically, you might be right. I would observe that the system of ping-pong, the use of the Parliament Act, is cumbersome and time-consuming and delaying. But you're quite right. If we don't design the elected Senate right, you end up having two chambers, both of which have equal legitimacy. So you get into a very technical debate around what's called an inferior mandate, ensuring that the elected Senate doesn't have the same status as the House of Commons does at the moment. And that means, rather like in America, perhaps, California has two senators, tiny Maine has two senators. It seems to have an inferior mandate to the House of Representatives. So maybe that's how you make it work in terms of a two-chamber situation. But I think it's really important that we do have a revising chamber.
Well, I would really love to dig into these details at a later date with you, Paul. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme. We'll have to have you back in the studio, perhaps, as soon as we can. Well, that's the end of the programme today. Coming up, it's To The Point after these messages.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV. On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world.